Right, ladies and gentlemen, it is 22:12, and we have the panel session for the next 3/4 of an hour or so. So welcome back to the second half of our programme, and it's my pleasure now to introduce our 4 panel members, who are Scott Knowles, Dr. Nick Katicha, Steve Martin, and last but not least, Bob Clarke. Scott has been Chief Executive of East Midlands Chamber for the last 6 years. And prior to that, he was 16 years as Director of Operations, then Deputy Chief Executive. The Chamber, of which I myself am a member, has over 4,100 members, and in addition, more than 3,000 affiliates, which was the last figure I could find. And prior to COVID, employed almost 150 people. And it is one of the most successful chambers in the country, winning British Chamber of Commerce Chamber of the Year in 2019. The chamber, like other chambers around the country, as John Robinson reported, offers extensive help to those wanting to trade internationally, from established businesses to those wanting to venture overseas for the first time. One thing that wasn't listed on Scott's CV, on LinkedIn at any rate, is that he does a nice line in stand-up comedy, having performed at the Leicester Comedy Festival in 2017 in a stand-up challenge to raise funds for a local charity. Dr. Nick Katicha, OBE, is founder and chairman of Morningside Pharmaceuticals, a business that he actually started from a desk in his garage 30 years ago. And he's now grown that into a £64 million company, which distributes pharmaceutical products throughout the UK and 120 countries throughout the world via UN organizations, NGOs, aid agencies, and charities, providing essential medical supplies to developing countries. The company itself has won countless awards, including a Queen's Award for Innovation in 2012 and a Board of Trade Award in 2018. And Dr. Nick himself was named Entrepreneur of the Year at the Lloyds Bank National Business Awards in 2019. And he received an OBE for services to entrepreneurship, innovation in pharmaceutical services, and philanthropy. And on this point, I can tell you his family charitable trust, the Randall Charitable Foundation, of which he's chair of trustees, does incredible work both locally and internationally with some valuable grants. Steve Martin, Managing Director of TW Kempton Corporate Clothing Limited, is our next panelist. Now, I've known Steve personally for 24 years when he was a sales manager, and subsequently became a director of the company in 2003 and is now its managing director. This followed on from a management buyout. The company was originally a specialist military network division of a larger group, but became independent in 1989. And whilst they still supply knitwear to the armed forces, 50% of their sales are now exported to over 30 countries. But the range that they sell now embraces everything uniform, from caps, berets, and footwear to jackets, fleeces, and even ballistic vests. In a period when the textile industry has been decimated in the East Midlands, TW Kempton have stood out as a real success story. And finally, let me introduce Bob Clarke, who is a member of our group, of our Midlands and East Anglia group for UK business advisors. He's a business advisor and management consultant with over 30 years of experience working with SMEs within the manufacturing, industrial, and logistical services sector. One of his current roles is working with Brexit for Business, which is providing insight and information to local businesses on the topic of Brexit. He is leading the import and export workshops to help clarify trade changes and new processes. So we've gathered a panel who don't just talk the talk, but they walk the walk. And so excited to be talking to them this morning. And we thought we'd start off with a bit of an exercise. And it's 10 months post-Brexit, or I should say, of course, exit from Europe. So what practical challenges are SMEs finding in international trade? I'm going to start with Scott on that one, if I may, please.
Hi, Elliot. Morning, just about everybody. And just in terms of the secret CV stuff you discovered there, Elliot, I think it'd be wise for me not to give up the day job anytime soon. So in terms of your question there, and that was an interesting comment you made there about European exit or Brexit. I would suspect our public sector colleagues absolutely are talking about European exit rather than Brexit, because that clearly appears to be sort of tone of government policy. But it certainly feels, talking to our SME members and those that wider business community that we work with, that it very much is still about Brexit. So at the moment, and I've got some really current sort of information for you. Some of you will know the Chamber publishes a quarterly economic survey, as does every chamber in the UK. And our Q3 survey results have just been published. So what are we finding from SME perspective? So I'd probably say you've got the full set of eccentricities of the import-export system as it stands currently in full effect. We've got many businesses that will tell us they're not really that affected. They've got a bit more administrative and a bit more of an admin burden to cope with. But I thought you'd find this quite interesting. So last week we had more than 200 inquiries around confusion around European VAT rules. So that was in 1 week, 200 inquiries. And the other big challenge that seems to be, and some of the previous speakers have alluded to this, but the sort of changing goalposts on import customs declarations. And we might all think these are done for the right reasons, about providing some additional easements for the importer, but it definitely feels like businesses are struggling to keep up with what's required and when. Probably very similar to how when the COVID rules were changing each week. So I'll pause there, Elliot, but that's the current biggest challenges that we're recording in any sort of quantity at the moment.
Yeah, and Nick and next after that, Steve. I mean, both of you are experiencing these things on the ground. Nick, what's your take on this? What are the challenges that you're finding?
Thank you, Elliot, and good morning, everyone. And Elliot, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I guess what I wanted to say first of all is I think that the level of speakers this morning has been fantastic, and it's really made the panel's life a lot easier because there's so much been covered, from logistics to finding new leads to actually the global strategy for export, as well as once you do find a customer, how you deal with them, the kind of things that you have to consider. So I think it's been a great morning session. But of course, the last 18-20 months have been very difficult for businesses, and specifically SMEs, because of Brexit, or the exit from the EU, as well as COVID. And this has created a lot of challenges, and we've seen that in our business. So just a little bit more about Morningside Pharmaceuticals. We manufacture generic medicines, and we supply those for export markets, as well as supply to the UK NHS, hospitals and pharmacies. But for that, we do a lot of importation as well. So we're involved in all the processes of export, from imports to exports. And the kind of things we've been seeing is, and it started really February, March last year, was supply chain issues. We hear a lot about truck drivers and vehicles and containers now, but that started all last year. And one of the reasons, especially from Europe, was because a lot of EU drivers are paid by the kilometre, not by the hour. So when you had big queues up, which we saw around March, April, May, I think it was last year, for a few weeks, a lot of EU drivers didn't want to come to the UK. And that meant a lot of UK drivers were having to go to the EU, pick things up and bring them back. And that almost created a shortage for drivers between the UK. So if I wanted to send something from Loughborough, where we're based, to Sheffield, we had a challenge in getting drivers. So that's carried on, and we've really got to work that out, because that's slowing things down. We've seen the challenges of ports. Felixstowe, just this week, we've been hearing about. We've heard this morning around the costs increases. So it's nearly $10,000 for a 20-40 foot container from China. India's increase. All of those markets are really a challenge. And of course, containers being stuck in the wrong places, which is causing shortages as well. Already we're hearing about inflationary pressures. The cost of goods are going up because of freight, regulatory, energy. All these things are challenges for businesses. And I think specifically Brexit, The biggest challenge we've seen in our sector is, because we don't have juices in pharmaceuticals, is the Northern Ireland issue, which thank God they're trying to sort out now. Over the last 2-3 days, we're hearing a lot of rhetoric from the EU and the UK trying to work together. But at the moment, the way it stands, UK medicines that we manufacture and we supply in Great Britain, way the rules are, we won't be able to supply those into Northern Ireland. So that's a massive challenge that's been there for the industry. But we think we're getting there, and government's going to change that and work with the EU to make that better. And just a last point around Incoterms that was mentioned by, I think it was Mike. Ex-works has been a really challenging Incoterm for European Union trade, because most EU suppliers never use ex-works. They would use FOB or DAP or something like that. So for them to do customs clearances on our behalf and things like that became a real challenge. And we had to set up new offices in Malta to move licenses for drugs in EU into Malta, as well as do customs clearances. Though freight agents can do that for you, but then it means that the supplier in the EU has to work with the freight agent, and they weren't keen to do that. And Scott will tell you there's still some real big challenges around rules of origin that's going on there. But what I would say to finish that point, because it was a question about what's been going on over the last 18-20 months, the positive is that we're learning, we're getting better, we're getting stronger, and we will come out of this. And there is still a massive market out there outside of the EU, which is where my business has been built over 30 years, in developing countries, which we saw in Ian's presentation this morning, which is open for business, and they want UK products, they want UK services.
Thanks, Nick. And Steve, I guess you've been experiencing similar problems, and particularly, of course, you both export and import goods, so you've got it coming both ways. Can you unmute yourself, please, Steve? Right. Is that better? Yeah. That is. Sorry, there always had to be one.
Sorry. Okay. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. And I must say, I've actually learned a lot from this morning's presentations. It's been very, very useful for me. I'd actually concur with what Nick has had to say. In that the biggest single issue for us is supply chain issues. If we go back to the beginning of January, then it was all to do with customers' declarations and documentation. That, to a large extent, has sorted itself out. We know what we're doing, and our customers have come to accept that particular challenge. Now, of course, it's a new one. It's supply chain issues and transport delays, particularly with exports, booking space on ships. And it's led to quite a significant increase in associated transport costs. And that is difficult to pass on to the consumer at the minute, especially if we still want to remain competitive with our export competitors. So we've got to try and work with these challenges that we have for the minute. Mike mentioned that it was going to be Q2 in 2022 before the shipping issues are resolved, and I wish I was as optimistic as you, Mike, in that respect. But let's see. So really, yeah, I also agree with Nick in terms of the Incoterms. Our clients are not used to working with ex-works, and we're having to adapt with them, and we're providing DAP terms in most instances. Work with the Chamber of Commerce. That would be my recommendation. They have an awful lot of expertise that they can bring to the table, and they can help SMEs tremendously.
Thanks, Steve. And Bob, finally on this particular question, I mean, you're working with, or you've been working with companies having to get to grips with the paperwork side of things. Is that situation easing? And indeed, are there other challenges that you want to bring to the table?
Yeah, okay, yeah, thanks, Elliot. I'd echo the findings of the other panelists who've just spoken. I mean, I was involved going back to December 19 through to May this year in doing things like seminars and webinars and one-to-one consultations with SMEs in 2 areas of the country. One was Greater Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and the other was Norfolk and Suffolk. Yeah, I mean, look, in the early days, it was going to, the real issue was going to be, how is this deal going to look? And we didn't really know until back end of December that what the real deal was. And of course, that introduced the lovely issue of rules of origin. Now, in the more recent period, I would agree actually with Steve's comments. I would say documentation issues were a prime problem to start with, but largely they've been resolved. The other issues that did come up and are still, I would suggest, still probably not so great now, but the use of Incoterms. You know, from what Mike Wallace was saying earlier, most exporters and SME exporters from the UK into Europe were, in particular, had been used to a door-to-door pricing model. And of course, their initial reaction really was to try and continue that, which meant a duty delivered paid Incoterm. And with the agreement, of course, that we had, that was going to be very, very difficult, because it meant you had to have some sort of representation, either virtually or in place on the ground with an authorised representative to take care of the VAT and the duty issues at the other side, and equally the other way round, and that forced some issues with some companies, to the extent that if they had an alternative supplier in the UK, they would go to that supplier. Equally, I suggest that would also be the case for the importers from UK suppliers as well. The other big problem, which I believe must have resolved itself now, and I can only talk really back to May this year for my own direct experience. The model, of course, that people were used to in terms of the physical logistics was basically just like a domestic movement, which was simple, it was easy, and that made Europe a very good place to export to. That changed overnight, because you then had, in particular, the large integrators like DHL, FedEx, etc., DPD, had major issues themselves in actually getting to grips with the demands of this new deal, in both sides, both in Europe and here in the UK. And that led to massive issues, particularly for areas of Germany, where the responsibility is devolved to various federal regions rather than a national overall overarching remit. I suggest that has probably improved. It must have done, but it was a major problem. So the other big one was Northern Ireland. Amazingly, in the areas that I was dealing with, which was in the east of England, Northern Ireland wasn't a big player. It probably would have been if we'd been looking at Lancashire and the west side of the country. Most people didn't even bother with it. Most exporters didn't bother with it. And the other issue was that I found with logistics businesses that were previously carrying out transport into Europe, most of them at the SME level, and I'm talking particularly 0 to 50 employees here, excuse me, had ditched Europe overnight. And that took a load of supply out of the logistics chain. Interestingly enough, they did not feel, well, they felt that was an advantage because, in the words of one, I remember it very clearly, European transport was always an issue, and it obviously became a much bigger issue once we got the New Deal in place, with delays, documentation and transit, etc. And there was sufficient demand in the domestic market at the rates required to be able to withdraw from Europe and just concentrate on UK. And I think facts bear that out now with, we know what the driver shortage issue is here in the UK. So that also was interesting from the point of view that most people or most exporters into Europe would rely on the integrators to do their work for them. And I'd say that there was a big gap in understanding and help from the integrators, depending on who you went to and where your regional office was, as to how successful you're going to be continuing your European movements. So yeah, look, that's just my view. It's a few points, but obviously things will have settled down to a certain extent. But I think we will also, looking back, find a structural change in where certain companies are not concentrate or have not concentrated on Europe for the last 6 months or so, and it'll be a slow reintroduction to those markets over the next, I don't know, 18 months, something like that.
Well, they might have exited the European markets. Are they attempting to replace it with further overseas, the US, Australia, New Zealand, that sort of thing?
Well, again, interesting comment, Elliot, because what they felt was they would be able to find sufficient replacement demand in the UK. Yeah. Which again surprised me, but that's what they were fairly confident of.
Yeah. And Nick, Steve, do both of you have you seen that, or because you've got heavy involvement in the European market anyway, you haven't noticed any change as far as that is concerned? Nick, is that fair or?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we've got existing relationships there so I think the business has been there, and for medicines, there's been a lot of work between the European Medicines Agency and the MHRA to make sure that the flow of medicines do carry on. So I think we've been a little bit lucky there, but we've had to change, as I mentioned, we had to set up an office in Malta to make sure that we could have licensing out there, because of course that a European license can't now be held in the UK and things like that. So it's created a bit of cost for us and some challenges in documentations, but the business is still going on.
Yeah, and Steve, again, what's your take on that?
We've seen delays in Europe. We've seen a modest reduction in exports to Europe, but that is starting to come back now. One observation that I would like to make, and that this really is directed, I think, perhaps to Ian Harrison, and that is an appeal to try and get the US duty situation resolved as quickly as possible. Our products, a lot of our products, are subject to a 16% duty into the USA, and that we can live with, and we've learned to accommodate that over the years. 2 years ago, the US government imposed overnight a 25% additional super tax on the products, which meant that we were paying a 41% duty on anything that we were exporting into the USA, which made our products completely uncompetitive, and we had to live through that. I know that there's a moratorium at the minute on that additional super tax, and we're hoping that will be removed completely. But it's vital to companies in our sector that are working in the US that Department of International Trade recognise the challenges that this super tax is creating for us.
Thanks, Steve. new question, and again, I'll address this one first to Scott. From what you're seeing through the chamber, what business sectors are best placed to take advantage of the international opportunities out there?
That's a great question. Certainly businesses with a strong IP. So medtech, Nick's already mentioned that, I think is absolutely prominent. I think advanced manufacturing, of course, we've got that real strong spine of manufacturing in the East Midlands. I think businesses that have got a really strong position in supply chain that actually can't be easily replaced. And we've certainly seen some robustness there since the 1st of January with many of those businesses. Just thinking about markets as well, following on from sort of Bob's commentary and also Steve's. We're certainly seeing from the 1,000 or so exporters that we work with on a monthly basis, sort of North America, so the USA, Canada, Mexico seem to be growing sort of fairly exponentially. And like Steve said, we saw from the businesses we work with on a trade perspective, we saw some weakening around Europe at the start of the year, but certainly in the last quarter that seems to be coming back with much more prominence. But yeah, I'd certainly say those with a strong IP, I think advanced manufacturing, medtech, and those that have got a significant strength in supply chain that are much more difficult to replace.
And Steve, from your perspective on that, I mean, are you finding there are new opportunities out there?
Yes, there are. It's been a very, very difficult and challenging time for everyone in the last 18 months. And some of the markets that we've been working in have been closed or dormant to us, but they are now reawakening, and we're finding that we are getting new inquiries and new opportunities coming through, particularly, I would say, from the US and also from Japan. Now, Japan's been very, very close to us for a while. We've grown our Japanese business substantially over the last 5 or 6 years, and it fell off a cliff last year, and it's certainly coming back again now, which is great news.
And Bob, are you seeing some new markets opening up for your clients?
I would say the one that comes to mind as being mentioned more than any other was the USA. I think it's fairly clear to those businesses that were seasoned exporters, the issues with Europe have switched international attention, or their international attention, to the US, where essentially the feeling was, and in practice, that the movements into US were basically easier than to Europe after the New Deal, which says quite a lot, I think. So yeah, the USA did stand out.
It's a bit more difficult for me to ask you that question, Nick, given that you're already in 120 countries. But is there a market out there that you would like to get into that's proving difficult?
Well, I mean, I think the business Morningside started 30 years ago as a 100% export business, and the real model was really around brand UK, and it stayed with us for 30 years. So we had the idea that people appreciated the high quality standards, the regulatory, the kind of way we do business in the UK, the service we provide in developing countries. And we started almost 100% in developing countries in Africa, Latin America, Caribbean, these markets. And it's great to see 30 years later, this is where we're really focusing now. And we came into EU very late. And we still don't do the US, we do Canada. So I think there's still some fantastic opportunities for any business who wants to export, especially in developing countries, because the way we do business, and as long as you've got a product, if it's manufactured in the UK, it's got some innovation, it's got some technology, as Scott mentioned, IP in there, they love those type of products, and the Middle East is a phenomenal market for those type of opportunities. So I think there's great opportunities there, and any company should export. But if you have something that's really a little bit more innovative, you have far better opportunities in these markets. But protect your IP is something I would say.
Yeah, because I mean, the developing countries expanding markets, but they come with their own challenges.
Absolutely, they do, and they take a bit of experience on there. You know, we've heard a lot about this morning about currency fluctuations, payments, logistics, getting products through customs. Every one of those countries will be very, very different, and not what we've been used to in the EU in the past, where we can get products in very, very quickly. So yeah, do your research definitely, and make sure you understand the market. And I'll hopefully be able to get a chance to talk about it later. Travel, go and see the markets. It's the best way of doing business.
Yeah, but Steve and Bob mentioned that people are coping better with the paperwork now as they've got more experience. But is there one area of the paperwork that still causes great problems, Steve, for you?
No, I wouldn't say that at all, Elliot. But we do work with a very, very good freight forwarder. We've worked with them for 30 plus years. And that is absolutely critical, because they can take us and hold our hand and take us through the process. Yeah,
and Bob, from your perspective, same sort of thing.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and that's basically the difference that I found. And again, I'm talking a few months ago now, but it's bound to be the same, I think. The understanding of the freight forwarders, as you might expect, traditional freight forwarders, is significantly, or has been significantly deeper, particularly with the issues on Europe, than the integrators. And that, I think, is one of the structural issues that we had when we introduced the New Deal. Excuse me, because the integrators are, from an infrastructure point of view, location point of view, resources point of view, they should tick all the boxes. But the one area that they fell down on was understanding what documentation requirements were, not just the export documentation, but the actual at the other end of the chain, what the import requirements were. And dealing with the VAT and the duty, and it caused major issues. First off, I'm sure that has become a lot better now, but in terms of the paperwork, it's obviously it's a two-way street. It's not just the export stuff you've got to think about. It's what's going to happen the other end, depending on the Incoterms as well, of course. But that they were the gaps that I found, and they were very big. Whereas a forwarder with a reasonable amount of knowledge will be able to get their head around it much quicker. But okay, arguably, possibly the freight forwarder, depending on where they are, what markets they're in, what volume they're dealing with, they're not necessarily dealing with the hundreds and thousands of packages that are moving every night across the channel or wherever in and out of the UK. So that was one of the other things, of course, is that the requirements documentation wise were significantly just raised through the roof. I think systems, digital systems, because we had most areas were well advanced in this, and I'm talking across the global nature of this in terms of what that means. I think those systems helped a scenario which could have been very, very different if we'd hit it 10 years ago. So advances within the forwarding community's IT systems and their ability to track and trace, that's helped things, and it will help things going forward. But of course, we can't ignore the fact that there is a barrier to trade with Europe. And the barrier to trade with Europe is the fact that you have to have documentation and you have to deal with customs, both ends of the cycle. So it isn't the same, and it won't be the same. And I would say, unless my fellow panelists may have a different view from this, what traffic that was taking 24 hours or 48 hours to move door to door, UK, Europe, is now, they've been put back at least 24 hours each and longer because of those requirements now with documentation. So we haven't got to the scenario where we can mirror yet exactly what was happening pre-1st of January.
Nick, yeah, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another point around documentation, because of course freight and logistics is very important, but we talked about payments a few minutes ago. And of course, the best way of doing business in exports is get 100% payment in advance, but it doesn't always work like that. So there's documents called letters of credits, which are issued between banks and banks, and it's probably a reasonably safe way of getting payment, but it's a minefield. So, if you are looking at exporting, one of the things is get involved with your bank, understand a little bit more about what letters of credits are to get a safe form of payment. And of course, with my DIT export champion hat on, there's also UK export finance from DIT. So if you do win a project somewhere, there is money out there where the UK government will support that project and help towards the payments and milestones as well. But it's just something that a lot of SMEs get stuck with, and we did for many years around letters of credits.
And Scott, yeah, I mean, you've got a whole section within the chamber that is dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. What's been the biggest hurdle that you found as far as members are concerned?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I agree with all the comments made. I mean, it certainly feels like it's settled down significantly from 6 months ago. One of the biggest sectors that we get inquiries from now, challenges around paperwork, delays, as Bob was talking about a few minutes ago, is food and drink. So food producers, beverage producers, or perhaps anything with an organic component to it, shall we say. Certainly many of the SMEs, we've got some fantastic food producers across the East Midlands and of course elsewhere, but certainly a big chunk of the inquiries of challenges around process seem to be coming from that sector. Still, that hasn't really settled down. If anything, it feels like it's perhaps accelerated, but they are very niche and sector-specific inquiries now.
Okay, let's change the subject slightly. And this is to all of you really. What are the most important lessons you've learned or have seen to help businesses grow internationally? Perhaps Nick, would you like to kick off on that one?
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. I think Nicola spoke a little bit about this earlier on. So I think having a clear vision of where you want to export and how your product fits in, understanding the leads and how you create those is really, really important, because once you find a distributor or an agent, there's a lot of things that come with that, and I've been caught out many times in different countries where I've appointed the wrong distributor. And of course, with pharmaceuticals, we need temperature control, we need pharmacovigilance, humidity control. The way the product's distributed in the country matters as much as how we freight it to a country. So I think do your research, make sure your product works for that market is really important. And I tell a lot of companies, feel it, touch it, do it. That's my phrase for exports, and that's really about understand what you want to export, where you want to export, and travel. It's been very hard over the last 18 months because of COVID, but the best way is to go on trade missions with chambers of commerce, with DIT, go to the country, understand, meet the people, understand the culture, and then that will make you a much stronger exporter. And of course, we've already heard today about the enormous amount of support we've got there. There's people there to help. Try and use that support, whether it be Institute of Exports or Chambers of Commerce, DIT, lots of organizations who've got data. But I think the message from me is visit the countries, understand, talk to people. Don't just rely on internet because it is a different world and different cultures to what we're used to in the UK.
That's a very good point, Nick. And Steve, I know you do a lot of traveling as part of the business, but what's your take on the lessons you've learned that other businesses can benefit from?
Okay, well, did a lot of traveling, I think, perhaps is more appropriate than do a lot of traveling.
Sorry, yes.
Looking forward to getting back on planes in the not too distant future. I'm starting to sound a little bit like an echo chamber for Nick here, and perhaps I'm a dinosaur. I've been in this business quite a few years. You have to get out and meet the people. You cannot do everything by Zoom. There is nothing to beat looking somebody in the eye and establishing a relationship with them. It's the only way to be successful in business. But what are the most important lessons I've learned? Well, perhaps I would say be cautious with export, but don't be frightened to export. And if I can just give you an example there, if I go back maybe 10 or 11 years, we had a completely out of the blue inquiry from a North African country. It was Libya, and this was in the time prior to Arab Spring. And I made several visits to Libya at the time, into Tripoli. And we were successful in winning a multi-million-pound contract for the supply of uniforms to them at the time, and we were helped enormously by our bank and by UK government agencies who we approached because at the time we were very, very cautious with dealing with Libya, but there was no other UK competitor. Nobody else was prepared to step into that market, and our competition was coming mainly from Southern Europe, from Italy, who've got very strong links with Libya. But we beat the Italians, we got the contract, and that carried on for a number of years. And I think we got our final payment out of Libya about a month before the Arab Spring. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you right now. So be cautious, but don't be frightened.
And Bob, anything to add on that front?
Yeah, no, just to say that, excuse me, when I was in the forwarding game, and Mike will know this better than most of us, when you're dealing internationally, it's exactly as Nick and Steve were saying. It's like doing business anywhere. You have to do your homework. You have to meet people, preferably face to face, and also you need to get the supply chain logistics side of it right. So to protect your service levels and protect your quality, and people like Mike and myself, well, I don't do it now, but I used to. We were traveling the world to our main markets every year, at least once or twice a year. To the States, we do it 4 times a year, and you would meet not only your counterpart who is dealing with logistics at that end, both from export and import end, as a forwarder and a broker, but you also met their clients and your clients' counterparts in that territory. So you were doing, actually part of it was you were supporting your customers as they were obviously your customers, but you're actually protecting them to get the best service, and that it all comes down to people. If you're meeting people on the ground, you're building up trust, you're building up understanding, and it's people business. Yes, we're talking about freight moving here, there, and everywhere, but at the end of the day, people are actually making sure that happens. So yeah, I'd echo exactly what Steve and Nick were saying on that.
Thanks, Bob. And a final word on this subject from you, Scott, if I may.
I think Nick's articulated it better than I can, which is you set your strategy, but it is then, of course, about sticking with it. My own experience of talking to SMEs, particularly those putting their toe into new markets for the first time, sort of expecting almost overnight success. Well, of course, that's fairly unrealistic, isn't it? So it is really about sticking with that strategy. Of course, the strategy needs to be well informed from your research and making sure you're picking the right markets, of course.
Thank you, Scott. And final quick question as we're coming to the end of our time, specifically to Nick and Steve, because both of them have been in the game for quite some time. But the question is, if you had a magic wand and could look back in time, is there anything you would do differently from a business perspective in respect of trading internationally? Now, Steve, we'll start with you on that one, please.
I've got a 3-word answer for you there then, Elliot. Make fewer mistakes.
Yeah, but we all make those throughout our working life. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's important to, there is no magic wand, but the important thing is you've got to be responsive, you've got to be adaptable and flexible to change, and you've got to be proactive. And those 3 things for our business have been key. We're at a totally different end of the spectrum in terms of technology to Nick. We're very low tech, but we're responsive and we are flexible, and it's stood us in very good stead over the years. And if you've got niche products, then that will certainly help. For goodness sake, don't join a race to the bottom, because you can never win that race.
Thanks, Steve. That's good advice. And last word on this from Nick.
I think some excellent advice. Steve said it all there. We will make mistakes. We all made mistakes, but we learn from them. But the opportunities with that whole world open is phenomenal. I guess the big one, and that I will just probably say that if I had the chance, I'd do it differently over 30 years, is maybe just the protection of IP. Because, of course, for a drug, you have to license that drug in a market, whatever country it is. So you have to give them the dossier, the IP. So just better control, picking of agents, distributors, stronger contracts is something that's always worth thinking about. But also think about, trademarks. We think about that in the UK and US and the developed world, but even in the developing world, that is important. And think about, making sure you've got the right brand name for that country, have a website for that brand name if you're really going to go into that market in a big way. There's lots of different things you learn, but the main thing is to do it. There is so much opportunity there. We've got a 65 million population here. We've got the whole world out there. And from what I've seen over 30 years, they are ready to do business with the UK. So the main thing is try. And what Scott mentioned there was really important. It won't happen overnight. It takes patience. You have to have a team that you build. And if you're trying to do it just part-time, maybe it's not going to work. So create some time, create an individual who can really focus on this and be adaptive, as Steve said, change. Just because you're doing something in the UK in a certain way doesn't mean you can do it in the same way in another country. So, yeah, I think I'll end with just saying lots of opportunities out there.
Thanks for that, Nick. And it's nice to end on a positive note. And I have to say, I've really enjoyed this morning. I've learned an awful lot that I didn't know before about exports. And even though I've been working with clients who've imported and exported goods for many, many years, we've heard from some great speakers. I'm very grateful to Ian Harrison from the DIT for leading us off and giving us a track of where lots of information can be held. A great talk, thank you, from Mike Wallace, who gave us some real practical tips on what to look for in terms of freight forwarding and so on. From Nicola Winters on, thank you, Nicola, for your advice on e-commerce matters, and from John Robinson, and who knew that you couldn't export a TV or the Quran to Saudi Arabia. but interestingly, they can buy our football clubs, but we won't go there. We've a terrific panel. I want to thank Scott, Nick, Steve, and Bob for some terrific advice and information. We've gone through quite a lot of stuff this morning, whether it's issues on VAT in Europe, problems with container costs and locations, need to consider your website to make it easy for overseas customers, need for face-to-face contact, and the fact that that particular website that both Ian and John put up, showing 20,000 opportunities for people who want to buy from the UK. That's a hell of a figure. And therefore, there've got to be some opportunities for us all out there to take advantage of exporting. So I want to thank all of you for attending. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you for your questions. As I said before, you will all get copies of the slides after the event. And once again, thank you very much indeed to all our speakers. And we're coming up to the latter part of the week, so an early wish for you to have a good weekend. And thank you for coming along. Thank you. Bye bye.